Thokozile Madonko is a feminist economist focusing on the economies of care work, social inequalities, public service provision, gender responsive budgeting, and austerity. Much of her research, thinking, and advocacy sits within the Southern African context, and she has worked as a public educator on developing budgets that actually meet public social needs. She has so much to teach us around an anti capitalist, feminist economic analysis. We were eager to ask her more about how she thinks about a gender just transition that actually accounts for care work, and what else feminist economics can help us see when we're thinking about how we resource a just transition.
Feminists have, for a long time, been calling for care and care work to be included as part of calls for and conceptualizations of a just transition. Can you tell us a little bit more about why care is a central issue for climate justice, for inequalities, for feminist economics, and why it's something that you have chosen to at least partially focus your career on and your research on?
Sure. I think one of the most important aspects of feminist economics is that it's grounded in asking questions about whose labor counts and what the purpose should be of economics. And part of that is looking at how we reproduce ourselves, so social reproduction. The very ways in which we exist as a species is determined by the laboring work of many people and predominantly women because of the way we've kind of sectioned out responsibilities as well as patriarchal norms and standards and so forth. So care has extended beyond caring for humans of each other, but also caring for nature. And there's a very strong history and evidence, and anthropologists and feminist anthropologists and ecofeminists have done a lot of work on this between caring work of each other as humans, but also caring work of nature. It needs to be included in a conversation about the just transition because it's the foundation of what we are as humans, as what it means to be human. And so care then becomes a central issue when we're talking about a changing climate or environment or biodiversity loss, what it is and the way in which we engage in our very ability to eat, to gather water, to sleep, to put the lights on, you name it, to drive our cars, to kind of give life to our economies is based off this very unacknowledged, unpaid, generally underpaid or low paid care work and caring for each other and the planet. When there are climate shocks like drought, biodiversity loss, floods, and so forth, research is showing us more and more that it is that women are the shock absorbers of those events and that they take up the responsibility of caring in terms of the actual impact of that shock. So it might be having to look after a loved one after fires because of smoke inhalation, or having to walk further to gather water, or having to care for people who are sick because of air pollution and so forth. We see that there's a profoundly unequal impact of climate change, particularly for women. And this is why, as feminists, we're concerned because it is about power and it's about the inequalities that then are perpetuated because generally women are lower paid. They're not able to go into the job market because they're having to look after loved ones or look after their environment or go walk further to get the water or whatever it might be to gather wood and so forth, and perpetuates these kinds of inequalities that we see currently in society. And so this is really why for feminist economics and for me, it's to unpack and kind of tease out and give evidence to what we know intuitively is happening and research on questions around who bears the cost of climate change, or climate shocks, or biodiversity loss. So this gives us an insight into potentially being able to say, what is it that we need to do when we're talking about adaptation, mitigation, and so forth, reparations, polluter pays. What does that all mean from a feminist lens? We see that the adaptation can end up exacerbating inequalities if it's not done properly. So, for example, land grabbing or farmers having to move their crops in the Sahel, having to move their crops closer to water, which then puts them in the way of migrating herdsmen. Then conflict arises, and then you've got people being killed and women being kind of, again, the shock absorbers in that example. So there's many examples from around the world of why it is we need to be able to ask the question around whose labor counts under climate shocks, and what should be the purpose then, a kind of economic thinking in the context of climate change.
I want to ask you more about that tension, that kind of really difficult tension around conceptualizing care work as just another form of work under capitalism, and thinking about economic frameworks that are pushing for care jobs to be recognized as green jobs, to have much more formalized care work industries, thinking about care jobs as needing to be higher paid, unionized, etc., with also balancing this cultural and social role that care has, that is beyond a capitalist framework, right? It is something that is undergirding and underlying so much of the way that we treat each other, the way that we create an ethic for what matters for us. And part of that is not just, formalizing care work, but actually having like a deeper recognition of the role care holds in all of our lives. And that feminists, I think, have really powerful things to say about both of those things. But sometimes there's a bit of tension, especially in climate conversations, in thinking about like what role we want a care analysis to play. If you're able to speak to that tension a little bit, or sort of how you think about the relationship between those two economic frameworks of care, that would be helpful.
In terms of the tension around how we talk about and think about care and counting care, I like to defer to Nancy Fraser's Cannibal Capitalism, in which she really, highlights that if we are serious about counting care, then it has to be an anti-capitalist pursuit. And so not all feminists are anti-capitalist, right? So they want to be able to have a green capitalism that then counts care in particular ways, and that ensures that women, just as men, are paid in the same way. So we have this language around women's empowerment, and so it all becomes part of the market. And that tension is one that is profoundly ideological and political. And I put myself squarely in the anti-capitalist camp, because capitalism itself, it's drawing on Marx and Marxist thinking, is about domination and exploitation and expropriation. And as Nancy Fraser talks about, is that even care itself is exploited under capitalism. She has this extended definition of capitalism, which is that capitalism is not just purely an economic manifestation, but is a social one. To dismantle that requires us to come right back to what it means to live and work and be in this world in ways that are just, that are based on mutual trust, love. We have bell hooks concepts of love become very important when talking about nature as well as each other. It's very difficult when you're dealing with very strong neoclassical, mostly male-dominated spaces, talking about the just transition, for example, to start saying, but what about love? The fact that we need to love each other and love the environment. For practical reasons, we have to get into the weeds, and say, are we gathering the data? Do we know how many hours women work outside of their paid employment to take care of the home? What does that look like? So we want to see what is that unpaid care burden and what would it cost, and costing it in the system that we work in under capitalism, because that's what economists, and particularly neoclassical economists, understand. They want, sort of the business case, to put it crudely. It's important not to forget that underlying this work is, for me at least, and for many ecofeminists and critical feminists, Marxist feminists, is that this should be a profoundly anti-capitalist space, and one in which we begin to think about how do we live and be in ways that could be enabling us to live responsibly in the spaces in which we live, to treat the environment and animals and plants and everything with respect, give them identity and sovereignty that they deserve. It's a very interesting tension, because if you read a lot of feminist economics coming out of the journal, for example, you're unlikely to find this kind of more radical thinking, unfortunately. there is a question about how we need to start citing each other, and we need to start amplifying the really Ben Vivier, theories coming out of Latin America. We're not at a loss for options of alternatives. It's just that those alternatives are not amplified in the academy and in research and in policy. To come back to saying, well, let's count care, we want to say let's count care beyond capital.
Thank you so much for that. You've put it wonderfully. So to bring us from there to, I suppose, a little bit more into how this translates in policy. What to you is a well-functioning care economy? When we go into rooms and we critique and we unpack and we challenge and we say we need to be thinking how we can engage with love, engage with care, engage in a way that's eco-socialist, dismantle these oppressive, patriarchal, capitalist, racist systems. What are we proposing, or what would you propose in its place?
That's such an exciting question, because visioning is such a beautiful thing that we don't have enough time to really reflect on. We're often fighting the battles and we forget to think about what those futures look like and what it could mean. And I think at its core, the dismantling of patriarchy, and in what ways would we do that? And to do that, we need to have a reimagining, a relearning of what democracy looks like, of what it means to engage in bringing in a rights-based lens to a democratic space that is profoundly anti-capitalist, that is not based on domination and subordination and racism and racial capitalism or extractivism. And I always argue that it's in the democratic process of coming together and meeting each other in our spaces and recognizing at our core the basics of equality and what equality means, what freedom is, freedom from, freedom to be. That will then provide a better way of understanding how we live with each other, with the land, and find ways to provide for each other. That doesn't mean that the majority of the world's population is not accessing the resources they need to be free from, free to, and equal, and to even engage meaningful in dialogue and conversation. I like the talk around the commonings, the importance of a kind of social commoning space and reclaiming the commons, basic areas of society and life that we should protect, our water sources, our food sources. When thinking about from an African perspective, it's also about sovereignty, right? So we have the ability to grow our own food, to manage our own resources, and to trade in ways that enables everybody to benefit, as opposed to this extractivist imperial mechanisms that we have at the moment. So at a global level, you want to see something like a global commoning, a global democratic process, so a UN that actually works for everyone. And then at a national level, a mirroring of that, where you don't have big money involved in politics, where you don't have economies based on extraction, but based on degrowth, in the sense of degrowth by uncentering growth and centering other forms of indicators. So health and well-being. We talk about degrowth, but it doesn't quite work in the South African context, for example, or African context, because you've got energy poverty, huge amounts of water scarcity. We do need a certain amount of growth, but it's a different kind of growth to enable people to benefit more sustainably from those kinds of investments. So at a very practical level, if I was to be talking to the Minister of Finance for South Africa, for example, I would be saying we want a universal basic income grant where everybody is covered, because at the moment in South Africa, from 18 to 59, if you don't have a job and you don't have a disability and you don't have a child, you have no access to support. And we have almost a 41% unemployment rate, which is up to 79% for young people in this country. So, that would go a long way to provide support and enable people to adapt to economic and climate shocks, as well as we saw in COVID, because they introduced a grant to support that group under COVID, and it has played an enormous role. We should just universalize it and make it a permanent feature to support people, and it would be a climate-friendly solution. It would also be to prioritize investment in infrastructure, but in social infrastructure, so health, hospitals, clinics, schools, public transport. So seeing social infrastructure as an investment rather than a cost, investing in nurses, teachers, doctors, because at the moment we're under fiscal consolidation and austerity, and they're cutting those. And those are green jobs. I mean, they're very low on the polluting scale, and they are predominantly jobs that are for women. You would be addressing the gender issue, the climate issue, as well as unemployment, and reclaiming the commons, which is the provision of public health and education. And then to look at really pushing hard on the cost of capital, because at the moment our debt portfolio is crowding out our ability to spend on health and education and to invest in these areas. And so we need to think about one of the calls coming out of the Finance for Development and as part of the G20 platform is this call for a debtors club, so that all the low middle income countries that are affected by debt can come together and as a bloc negotiate with creditors. Because at the moment there isn't the power, even though they're the global majority that are suffering under enormous pressures for the cost of debt to those countries, and then crowding out their ability to pursue their developmental agendas, in particular their climate requirements. And so they're not in a position to handle a climate shock like a flood or a fire, because there isn't the money to even repair what is damaged. So I think that would be one kind of practical way of sort of going from the love right down to this is what a care economy could look like now. But more broadly, I think we need to have a fundamental shift in the way we engage with each other, which has got to be anti-capitalist, anti-extractive, right? Non-discriminatory, non-sexist.
You actually had such a wonderful segue there, and we're going to go back to your conversation with the Minister of Finance momentarily, because we're interested in asking a bit more about budgeting and all of your work in research and thinking. Of course, one of the major sticky areas, particularly in the just transition negotiations at the UN, is, of course, how to pay for the transition. Who's paying? Where are the resources coming from? What kinds of shifts in our economic systems from the global to the national to the local level need to happen to enable a just transition? So we're curious to hear a little bit more about how you understand budgeting as a political and economic tool, as something to advance a just transition. Are there things you wish more people knew about budgeting? Are there specific aspects of public budgeting that you feel like get lost in this larger economic policy conversation? What should we know about budgeting?
So the most important thing you need to know about budgets is that they start with political choices and they end with political choices. And they are far too important to leave up to economists. And I'm quoting, I think, Thomas Piketty there. We need to democratize and fully familiarize ourselves with fiscal policy. So there's lots of big words: monetary policy, fiscal policy, inflation, headwinds. It's a language in and of itself. And so demystifying economics and the discipline of economics is absolutely critical. As Clara Mattei has said in her book, The Capital Order, the technocrats have taken over and have convinced us that, budgets are a technical exercise and not a political exercise. When you read a budget document, be it for your city or your country, that is a political document, and it's telling you about the winners and the losers. So I always like to say when I'm doing trainings on budget literacy that it's like a good murder mystery. You get to know when you read the numbers, who's done it, basically. Like you can figure out who's been taken out and who's been doing the taking out. When budgets are cut, which is really where I come in on my area of focus around what is now called fiscal consolidation, but can really be defined as austerity. Post the 2008 financial crisis, there was this moment in which everyone thought we were Keynesian again and that there would be this big spending in social services. But what we've seen is, there wasn't a big shift at all. It was a momentary blip. Gabriela Gabor calls it the Wall Street consensus at the IMF, World Bank, and the rating agencies and the big banks and so forth that now dominates what it is that countries can do in terms of developing, designing their budgets. What I would really like people to understand is that it's critical to engage in your country's budget process and at the very least to demand budget transparency. I was part of the Open Budget Index produced by the International Budget Partnership. And that was a move and a push to get countries to make budget data available. Transparency becomes an important thing, and access to information around budget information is core before we can start even talking about how to engage with finance ministries, line ministries, and so forth in relation to getting better budgets developed, or even talking about gender responsive budgeting. You need the information and you need the budgets in an accessible format. So that's something that I really wish more people would push for. And even in the climate movement, we're talking about climate finance. That finance makes no sense if you can't access the information about where it's going or what those loans mean. The critical thing is that there must be public engagement in the final decisions that are reached around the distribution of resources. And there should be participation in the lead up to what gets tabled in Parliament by the Finance Ministry or Treasury, and there should be engagement through parliaments to be able to say whether those are just or fair ways of distributing resources, raising resources and distributing resources. So also the balance between taxation and expenditure. So taxation often falls away in the conversation, and many people engage in the expenditure side, which just takes you into the corruption conversations and where the money goes. But there's very little conversation, and this is why the Tax Justice Initiative is so important, is the questions about revenue and who gets taxed. And given the nature of what has happened over the last, effectively since 2008, is that countries have stopped taxing wealth and they've started borrowing from wealth. And so the debt arrangements that we see are very much related to this shift to the Wall Street consensus, whether it's domestic lending or international lending. And so when we're talking about climate finance, and there's big talk about, all this money that's going to come in, and it's going to be blended finance, which means it's going to be public and private finance, and which actually just means that the public sector is going to underwrite or say they will guarantee those private. So people then take the fall if anything happens, because it's the taxpayers who then have to pay for the fallout. So we have to be very skeptical about the language around climate finance and green bonds and all of this kind of thing, because it could just be another mechanism of imperial exploitation, and also another way in which governments and their elites in particular, domestic and international, extract resources from the many to the few. To me, the interesting thing is that most of the time, budgets don't tell us whose labor counts. And the research that we do to see what is the impact of expenditure decisions or revenue decisions, tax incidents, who gets affected by a tax decision, whether it's the introduction of a sales tax or value-added tax, which we know is a regressive tax and it impacts low-working, poor households, particularly women. Those kinds of questions become important, and that story is often not told in the official documents. And so we need alternative budgets and alternative conversations around budget information, and that's where the advocacy becomes so important. The beauty of feminist economics is that it offers a vision where care is treated as a public good, and so demands a particular kind of budgeting that isn't currently happening in many countries globally because of the implementation of austerity measures. And now, with the rise of increasing militarization, we've got this kind of Keynesian militarized stimulus with austerity, which makes it quite confusing, because it looks as if these governments are spending more money, but actually they're spending the money on arms to kill people and to kill children. They're not investing in social infrastructure like clinics, health, elderly, whatever it might be. The most important thing is to really talk about fiscal accountability, to demand fiscal accountability, and to demand transparency so that we have good budgets that really serve both people and planet.
The work that you do on budget literacy is such an important piece of work. With your point about militarism, we have been thinking a lot about that recently as well. Even in a recent energy just transition dialogue that we took part in, we highlighted a new report that talked about critical minerals for the energy transition and who defines what's critical and what isn't, and how many of those are not actually critical for energy, but rather components and for military and military equipment or technologies and those kinds of things. And so the military question is really one that needs to be given attention as well when we talk about the transition. A tiny follow-up, which is on your work around austerity and thinking about how in economies that are growth orientated, this cycle of growth and recession is almost presented as this inevitability, and austerity in response to recession also presented as an inevitability. And curious to your insights in how we challenge that and how we push forward alternatives to austerity.
There's multiple ways to define austerity, and so it's important to kind of clarify how I'm thinking about austerity. And I borrow heavily from Clara Mattei and her definition of austerity, and she talks about the austerity trinity, which is fiscal, monetary, and industrial austerity. She shows that austerity, the way that it has been implemented historically, is actually not cyclical. Her research looking back in post-World War I shows that even though there was this expansion of the welfare state, there was a very strong austere talk at the same time, and the tightening of the belt. And in fact, she sort of talks about how austerity also doesn't really make a distinction between fascism and democracy, because she compares democratic United Kingdom and fascist Italy, and how the economists in the UK were envious of the Italian economists because they could do more. They could discipline their populations faster and quicker through violent means. Austerity, in her understanding, and I borrow it and take it further, is that it's just a mechanism for restoring order within the capital order. It's baked into capitalism's logic. In order to think of an alternative to austerity, then, you have to think of an alternative to capitalism. Even in South Africa, for example, where we were told a universal basic income grant was impossible, would never happen, can't afford it. And then COVID hit, and suddenly, overnight, they introduced what is almost 99% UBIG. They just didn't make it universal. Great resignation in the US, for example, where people stayed at home and got their checks and were like, why do we need to go back to work under these terrible conditions of extractivism? So it is not surprising that we're seeing a fascist backlash globally. Clara's work would say this is just part of the course, right? This like austerity is just being used to discipline the masses, essentially. And I could say the same in the South African context. In 2012, when we really ramped up our austerity policy, there was a huge set of campaigns happening in the country politically around better working conditions for mining workers, access to higher education, and a national health insurance similar to the UK. Huge politically pressure to have these put in place. And what do we see happen? In the wake of this, a number of, I think, 42 mine workers were killed, and austerity gets implemented, and South Africans are told to do more with less. Literally, that was what the National Treasury put in their official document in 2013 when the budget got passed. They said, we now have to do more with less, which is a typical austere, because who is doing the more? It is women. who are the shock absorbers with these budget cuts. And so we've seen since 2012 the hollowing out of the public service in South Africa. When you look at the budgets and the actual details of who are the winners and who are the losers, you will see that it is the Wall Street consensus that has won. And so in South Africa, the largest component of spending now since 2012 is our repayments on our debt. It is bigger than health, bigger than education. That wasn't the case before 2012. And so it is the capital has been restored and they are gaining. I've been fortunate enough to work with the Budget Justice Coalition in South Africa, which is a movement of civil society activist organizations that have been pushing for a gender responsive, socially responsible, climate friendly budget, that actually responds to the needs of the majority as opposed to supporting the few, which is what happens under austerity. So the alternatives to austerity are about, again, claiming the commons, claiming public services, reclaiming and really signaling that health, education, water, public transport, energy are not for the market. These are things that should be social, democratic, equally distributed in ways that meets people's needs.
Thank you so much, Toko. I feel you've really clearly and powerfully outlined how public service provision, public budgeting, an end to austerity, economic justice broadly are really necessary to achieving not just a just transition, but a gender just transition. Is there anything that feminist economics can really offer us that you haven't gotten the chance to speak to that you'd like to mention?
Feminist economics has really offered this vision that care be treated as public infrastructure, and to do so in a way that is not purely economic, right? So recognizing that care is also how people function and be and do and the ethics of it. It means asking questions like, does the tax system and the budget expand the capacity of society to care? We really want a progressive tax system. We want health systems, education, childcare, elder care, whatever it might be, environmental care that is just and fair and is done in a way that is democratic and anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist. Feminist economics makes us think seriously about gender inequality and whether we are building a more resilient, just, and sustainable economy for everyone.